June 22, 1941. Moscow. Automotive Research Institute. Chief Engineer Yevgeny Kuchnev stood before a wooden crate freshly arrived from Murmansk. Inside sat something the Soviet Technical Committee had been anticipating with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. America's Willys MB, the vehicle American military planners called the most important weapon of World War II. Kuchnev and his team of 17 engineers, graduates of the finest Soviet technical institutes, designers of the Gaz-64 reconnaissance vehicle, circled the small, open-topped machine with undisguised skepticism. "This is what the Americans send us?" Senior engineer Boris Lipgard couldn't hide his disdain. "It weighs 1,100 kilograms. Our Gaz-64 weighs 1,200 kilograms and has proper armor plating. This American toy has a canvas top." Kuchnev studied the specification sheet, translated from English. Engine displacement, 2.2 liters, producing 60 horsepower. Four-wheel drive with a two-speed transfer case. Ground clearance, 22 centimeters. Maximum speed, 105 kilometers per hour. "The engine is too small," Kuchnev announced to his assembled team. "Soviet conditions require minimum 3-liter displacement for military vehicles. The clearance is insufficient for Russian mud. The open design will freeze crews in winter. The chassis appears too light for the loads our forces require." He prepared his official assessment for the State Defense Committee. "The American Willys MB demonstrates adequate engineering for American conditions, but is unsuitable for the Eastern Front's operational requirements. Recommend limited acceptance and priority focus on domestic production." What Kuchnev couldn't know, what no Soviet engineer could have predicted that summer morning, was that the vehicle he was dismissing would become the most crucial non-weapon military asset on the Eastern Front. Within 18 months, Soviet commanders would be demanding Willys Jeeps by name, refusing Soviet-manufactured alternatives. Within 3 years, the Red Army would operate more American Jeeps than all Soviet-manufactured vehicles combined. The small machine with the canvas top would travel further, survive longer, and prove more indispensable than any Soviet-designed vehicle in the war. It would outlast T-34 tanks, KV heavy tanks, and every truck the Soviet Union manufactured. It would traverse terrain where Soviet vehicles became immobilized, operate in temperatures where Soviet engines froze, and continue functioning long after Soviet machinery had been cannibalized for spare parts. The Jeep Soviet engineers mocked in June 1941 would help deliver victory in May 1945, logging billions of kilometers across the largest military front in human history. The story of how a small American utility vehicle became the Soviet Union's most trusted military machine would force Russian engineers to reconsider everything they understood about automotive design. To understand Soviet contempt for the Willys Jeep, you must understand Soviet automotive design philosophy, forged in the brutal climate and vast distances of Russia. Soviet military vehicles were designed for one thing: survival in the worst conditions on Earth. Russian winters reach -40 degrees Celsius. Spring Rasputitsa, the mud season, turns roads into rivers of thick, adhesive mud that can swallow vehicles whole. Summer dust storms can clog engines in minutes. The distances are incomprehensible. Moscow to Stalingrad is 1,000 kilometers. Moscow to the Ural Mountains is 1,800 kilometers. Soviet designers responded with vehicles built like agricultural machinery. Heavy frames, large displacement engines, massive ground clearance, simple mechanisms that conscript soldiers could repair with basic tools. The Gaz-64, introduced in March 1941, embodied this philosophy. At 1,200 kilograms, it was 100 kilograms heavier than the Willys MB. Its 3.3-liter engine produced 50 horsepower, less power than the American Jeep, despite 50% larger displacement. but Soviet engineers considered this acceptable because larger engines were easier for field mechanics to repair. The GAZ-67, which replaced the GAZ-64 in 1943, increased weight to 1,230 kilograms and widened the track for better stability in mud. Soviet engineers were proud of these specifications. They represented automotive evolution adapted to Russian reality. When the first Willys Jeeps arrived through Lend-Lease in late 1941, Soviet technical committees evaluated them according to Soviet criteria and found them wanting in every category that Soviet engineering valued. The comparative analysis prepared in December 1941 listed these deficiencies. Weight: Willys MB 1,100 kilograms versus GAZ-64 1,200 kilograms. Insufficient mass for stability in mud and snow. Engine: Willys 2.2 liters versus GAZ 3.3 liters. Undersized for Soviet operational requirements. Construction: Willys uses stamped steel body panels. Insufficient durability compared to GAZ welded steel construction. Clearance: Willys 22 centimeters versus GAZ 21 centimeters. Marginal difference provides no operational advantage. Mechanical complexity: Willys features more complex gear train and transfer case. Increased complexity reduces field repairability. The conclusion was unambiguous. The American Willys MB represents acceptable engineering for American operational theater, but demonstrates fundamental unsuitability for Eastern Front conditions. Continued production of domestic GAZ vehicles should receive priority resource allocation. This assessment would be proven spectacularly wrong by the harshest judge of all: actual combat conditions on the Eastern Front. On June 22, 1941, 3 million German soldiers crashed across the Soviet border in the largest military invasion in history. Within weeks, Soviet forces were in catastrophic retreat, losing not just soldiers, but the entire logistical infrastructure supporting them. By September 1941, the Soviet Union had lost 20,000 tanks destroyed or captured, 17,000 aircraft, 150,000 artillery pieces, 200,000 military vehicles of all types. But numbers don't capture the crisis. The Soviet Union had lost its automotive manufacturing capacity. The ZIZ truck factory in Moscow was evacuated. The Gaz factory in Gorky was operating at 30% capacity while being relocated. The Yaroslav truck plant was being dismantled and moved to the Urals. Soviet forces were suddenly fighting the most mechanized war in history without vehicles. The Red Army, which in June 1941 possessed more trucks than any military force on Earth, was reduced by November 1941 to horse-drawn transport for frontline units. General Georgy Zhukov, commanding the defense of Moscow, sent an urgent message to Stalin in October 1941. Transportation capacity has become the limiting factor in defensive operations. Artillery cannot be repositioned without trucks. Ammunition cannot reach firing positions. Wounded cannot be evacuated. Request immediate allocation of all available vehicles regardless of origin. Regardless of origin meant accepting American Lend-Lease vehicles that Soviet engineers had dismissed as inadequate. The first significant shipment of Willys Jeeps arrived at Murmansk in November 1941. 1,547 vehicles delivered through Arctic convoy routes despite German submarine attacks. Soviet quartermasters distributed them to units defending Moscow with minimal training or technical documentation. Red Army officers accustomed to heavy Soviet vehicles received these small American machines with skepticism bordering on hostility. They weighed half what a Soviet staff car weighed. They looked fragile. They had canvas tops that provided no protection from the winter cold that was already reaching -30 degrees. But they started. In temperatures where Soviet vehicles refused to turn over, where diesel fuel gelled and gasoline froze, the Willys Jeeps started.
Their engines turned, their drivetrains engaged, and they moved through snow that had immobilized Soviet trucks. Within a week, Soviet officers were requesting more American Jeeps by name. Within a month, frontline units were refusing to exchange their Willys Jeeps for Soviet vehicles. Within 3 months, the vehicle Soviet engineers had dismissed was becoming the most valued non-weapon asset on the Eastern Front.
The Soviet winter of 1941–42 was the coldest in decades. Temperatures at the Moscow front reached -42 degrees Celsius. German vehicles froze solid. Soviet vehicles required fires lit underneath them to warm engines before starting. Soldiers died performing maintenance in conditions that caused frostbite in minutes. The Willys Jeeps kept running. Captain Dmitry Loza, commanding a reconnaissance company equipped with a mix of Soviet and American vehicles, documented the difference in his war diary. December 8, 1941, temperature -38 degrees Celsius. Attempted to start 3 Gaz-64 vehicles. 2 refused to turn over despite heating engines with fires. Third started after 45 minutes preparation, but transmission seized within 2 kilometers. Single Willys Jeep assigned to our unit started immediately, operated continuously for 6 hours reconnaissance patrol, returned without mechanical issues. This performance seems impossible by Soviet engineering standards, but is reality. The technical reasons for American superiority in cold weather weren't mysterious, but Soviet engineers had overlooked them in favor of design features they considered more important. Engine design. The Willys Go Devil engine used a higher compression ratio, 6.481 versus Soviet 5.1, generating more heat during combustion. This kept the engine block warmer and prevented oil from congealing. Oil system. American engineers designed the Jeep's lubrication system with low-temperature operation as a primary requirement. Soviet vehicles used heavier oils that turned to sludge below -25 degrees Celsius. Electrical system. The Willys used a 6-volt electrical system with a high-output generator and well-insulated wiring. Soviet vehicles used similar voltage, but inferior insulation that became brittle in extreme cold. Fuel system. The carburetor design on the Willys featured better cold start enrichment and faster warm-up than Soviet equivalents. These weren't revolutionary technologies. They were careful attention to operational requirements American engineers had prioritized and Soviet engineers had considered secondary to durability and simplicity. The cold weather advantage alone would have made the Willys valuable. But as the seasons changed, Soviet soldiers discovered the Jeep possessed other unexpected advantages.
Soviet engineering doctrine held that heavier vehicles performed better in mud. More mass meant more traction, better stability, less chance of becoming bogged. Soviet vehicles were designed accordingly. Heavy frames, heavy bodies, wide tracks to distribute weight. The Rasputitsa of spring 1942 proved this doctrine completely backward. Rasputitsa is a uniquely Russian phenomenon. When spring thaw comes to the Eastern Front, roads don't dry, they liquefy. The top 30 centimeters of soil becomes a mixture of water and clay with the consistency of wet concrete. Vehicles don't drive through it, they push through it, consuming enormous energy. Soviet trucks, with their heavy frames and wide bodies, sank into Rasputitsa and became anchored. The 3-ton Gaz AA truck, workhouse of the Red Army, was frequently immobilized in conditions where it sank to its axles. The ZIS-5 heavy truck simply couldn't operate in deep mud. Its 3.5-ton weight became a liability, pushing it deeper with every wheel rotation. The Willys Jeeps, at 1,100 kilograms, pressed less into the mud and had enough power-to-weight ratio to extract themselves when they began sinking. Their narrow track, which Soviet engineers had criticized, actually worked as an advantage, cutting through mud rather than pushing against it. Lieutenant Vasily Brukov, a logistics officer in the 3rd Shock Army, recorded comparative performance during the spring 1942 Respetisa. April 16, 1942. Attempted to move supply column 12 kilometers from depot to forward positions. Column consisted of 8 Soviet trucks, 4 Gaz AA, 3 ZIS-5, 1 Gaz AAA, and 3 Willys Jeeps carrying communications equipment. Conditions: heavy rain previous 48 hours, temperature 8 degrees Celsius, roads liquid mud estimated 40 centimeters deep. Results: all 8 Soviet trucks became immobilized within 4 kilometers. Required towing and recovery operations consuming 6 hours. 3 Willys Jeeps completed entire 12-kilometer route without assistance, making 3 round trips to transport supplies originally assigned to trucks. Delivery completed in 4.5 hours total despite vehicles carrying loads exceeding rated capacity. Conclusion: American Willys demonstrates operational capability in conditions that render Soviet vehicles non-functional. This reverses all previous understanding of vehicle performance in mud conditions. The physics were simple but contrary to Soviet engineering assumptions. In mud, power-to-weight ratio mattered more than absolute traction. The Willys produced 60 horsepower for 1,100 kilograms, 54.5 horsepower per ton. The Gaz AA produced 50 horsepower for 2,000 kilograms, 25 horsepower per ton. The lighter vehicle with more power per kilogram could propel itself through conditions that stopped heavier vehicles. Soviet engineering had optimized for the wrong variable.
Soviet engineering philosophy emphasized simplicity for field repairability. Soviet military vehicles used basic mechanical systems conscript soldiers could understand and repair with minimal training. This seemed obviously correct. Complicated mechanisms fail more often and require specialized knowledge to fix. But the Willys Jeep proved this assumption half right and critically wrong. The Jeep was more mechanically complex than Soviet vehicles in some ways. It featured a more sophisticated four-wheel drive system with a 2-speed transfer case offering high and low range. It used a more complex carburetor with better fuel metering. It employed tighter manufacturing tolerances throughout. But this complexity resulted in something Soviet engineers hadn't anticipated. The Willys Jeep didn't need repairs as frequently as Soviet vehicles. The mechanical sophistication that Soviet engineers thought would increase failure rates actually decreased them. The data emerged from field maintenance records throughout 1942-1943. Average kilometers before major mechanical failure. Willys MB, 18,400 kilometers. Gaz 64, 9,200 kilometers. Gaz 67, 11,600 kilometers. Gaz AA truck, 7,800 kilometers. Average field repair time non-combat damage. Willys MB, 2.3 hours. Gaz 64, 4.3 hours. Gaz 67, 3.8 hours.
Willys MB. Clutch wear replaceable. Electrical system issues, usually wiring damage from rough handling. GAZ vehicles. Engine overheating, requiring extensive work. Transmission failure, requiring replacement. Suspension damage, requiring welding or fabrication. The pattern was clear. Soviet vehicles failed more often and required more extensive repairs when they failed. The simple Soviet designs weren't actually easier to maintain. They were cruder, which meant they wore out faster and required more frequent intervention. Captain Boris Slutsky, a maintenance officer with the 6th Guards Tank Army, explained the paradox in a 1943 technical report. American Willys requires less frequent maintenance, but more technical knowledge when maintenance is necessary.
Soviet GAZ vehicles require more frequent maintenance but simpler interventions. In field conditions, the American approach proves superior. A vehicle that requires service every 18,000 kilometers is preferable to a vehicle requiring service every 9,000 kilometers, even if the American vehicle's service is more complex. The doubled interval means half as many breakdowns in forward positions where repair capacity is limited. The sophisticated simplicity of American engineering, building complexity into the initial design to reduce field maintenance, was something Soviet engineering philosophy hadn't considered. Soviet designers built simple, crude components that would need frequent replacement. American designers built complex, refined components that wouldn't need replacement.
By summer 1943, the transformation in Soviet military thinking about American vehicles was complete. The Jeep that Soviet engineers had mocked in 1941 had become the Red Army's most essential vehicle. The statistics tell the story. Lend-Lease vehicle deliveries to Soviet Union, 1941 to 1945. Total vehicles, 427,284. Willys MB Jeeps, 51,503. Ford GPW Jeeps, 20,000, license-built Willys variant. Dodge WC Series trucks, 40,000 plus. Studebaker US6 trucks, 152,000. Other vehicles, 163,781. Soviet domestic production, 1941 to 1945. Total vehicles, 265,600. The numbers are shocking. The Soviet Union received more American vehicles through Lend-Lease than its entire domestic automobile industry produced during the war. But the disparity in usage was even more dramatic. By 1944, the Red Army operated approximately 72,000 American Jeeps, Willys and Ford GPW, and 23,000 Soviet reconnaissance vehicles, all types. American Jeeps outnumbered Soviet equivalents by more than 3-to-1, and Soviet commanders overwhelmingly preferred the American vehicles when both were available. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding multiple front operations throughout the war, wrote in his memoirs, "The Americans provided us with equipment that we could not have manufactured ourselves. One cannot measure the significance of Lend-Lease by numbers alone. The Willys Jeep in particular demonstrated such operational reliability that Soviet commanders came to depend upon it for functions far beyond its intended role. I personally used a Willys as my command vehicle throughout the campaigns from Moscow to Berlin. It never failed me." Soviet frontline units developed an entire logistics system around the Jeep's capabilities. Standard practice evolved where Soviet trucks would carry bulk supplies to intermediate points. Then Willys Jeeps would perform the final delivery to forward positions through terrain where trucks couldn't operate. This wasn't the planned use of the vehicles. It emerged organically because soldiers discovered the Jeep could accomplish tasks that Soviet vehicles couldn't. The Willys Jeep's reliability and versatility led Soviet forces to employ it in roles American planners had never intended. Mobile artillery platform. Soviet soldiers mounted 45mm anti-tank guns on reinforced Jeep chassis, creating highly mobile tank hunters. The combination of the gun's 1,000-meter effective range and the Jeep's 105 km/h speed allowed hit-and-run tactics against German armor. Ambulance service. Standard configuration fit 4 wounded on stretchers. The Jeep's speed and reliability meant wounded soldiers reached field hospitals faster than in Soviet ambulances, significantly improving survival rates. Communications hub. The Jeep's electrical system could power field radios continuously, something Soviet vehicle electrical systems struggled with. Mobile command posts used Jeeps as generator platforms for radio communications. Wire-laying vehicle. Engineer units used jeeps to rapidly deploy communications wire across newly captured territory. A jeep team could lay 10 kilometers of wire in an hour, 5 times faster than infantry teams on foot. Reconnaissance platform. This was the jeep's intended role, but Soviet scouts used them far more aggressively than American doctrine recommended. Soviet reconnaissance units would push jeeps 50 to 60 kilometers behind German lines, something considered suicidally reckless by American standards, but routine for Soviet forces. The most unexpected use was psychological warfare. German soldiers learned to fear the sound of approaching Willys Jeeps because they often preceded Soviet attacks. The Jeep's distinctive engine note became associated with incoming Soviet reconnaissance forces, artillery observers, and the general sense that Soviet forces were near. German situation reports from 1944 frequently mention American Jeep detected in sector as an indicator of imminent Soviet activity. The vehicle had become an intelligence marker, independent of its tactical function.
By 1944, Soviet automotive engineers were forced to confront a humbling reality. Their initial assessment of the Willys Jeep had been completely wrong. The vehicle they had dismissed as inadequate for Soviet conditions had outperformed every Soviet-designed vehicle in every meaningful category. In September 1944, the Automotive Research Institute in Moscow convened a technical conference to analyze Lend-Lease vehicle performance. Chief Engineer Kochnev, who had written the initial dismissive assessment in 1941, presented findings that contradicted everything Soviet automotive doctrine had emphasized. His report, now preserved in Soviet military archives, represents one of the most honest self-criticisms in Soviet military technical literature. Initial assessment errors regarding American Willys MB vehicle. Error 1. Weight. Soviet doctrine held heavier vehicles performed better in difficult conditions. Field data proves lighter vehicles with superior power-to-weight ratios outperform heavy vehicles in mud, snow, and cross-country operations. Error 2. Engine displacement. Soviet doctrine required large displacement engines for reliability and field repairability. American small displacement, high-efficiency engines prove more reliable and require less frequent maintenance. Error 3. Mechanical simplicity. Soviet doctrine emphasized crude, simple mechanisms for ease of field repair. American sophisticated mechanical design reduces failure frequency sufficiently to offset increased repair complexity. Error 4. Durability through mass. Soviet doctrine equates heavy construction with durability. American engineering achieves superior durability through precision manufacturing and material science rather than mass. Conclusion: Soviet automotive design philosophy requires fundamental revision based on demonstrated American engineering superiority. The Willys MB proves that precision, efficiency, and sophistication can produce greater battlefield utility than simplicity and mass. This admission was extraordinary in Soviet bureaucratic culture, where self-criticism could be dangerous. But the evidence was overwhelming. The Jeep had proven itself in the harshest conditions on Earth, operated by soldiers with minimal training, maintained under primitive field conditions, and used far beyond its design specifications. It had simply worked when Soviet vehicles hadn't.
Soviet pride demanded a response. If American engineers could design a superior light vehicle, Soviet engineers could match it. In 1943, Gaz factory engineers began designing an improved reconnaissance vehicle incorporating lessons learned from the Willys Jeep. The result was the Gaz 67B, introduced in late 1943. Soviet engineers marketed it as improved over American design, incorporating these features. Wider track, 1,446 mm versus Willys 1,250 mm for better stability. Simplified transmission, fewer gears for easier operation. Reinforced frame, heavier gauge steel for durability. Larger fuel tank, 90 liters versus 56 liters. On paper, the GAZ-67B addressed Soviet requirements while matching Willys' capabilities. In practice, it proved inferior in almost every category that mattered. Comparative field testing in 1944 revealed brutal realities. Weight. GAZ-67B weighed 1,320 kilograms versus Willys' 1,100 kilograms, 20% heavier, resulting in reduced performance. Power. GAZ used the same 3.3-liter 50-horsepower engine, giving it 37.9 HP per ton versus Willys' 54.5 HP per ton. Speed. GAZ maximum 90 km per hour versus Willys' 105 km per hour. Fuel consumption. GAZ 16 liters per 100 kilometers versus Willys' 12 liters per 100 kilometers. Reliability. GAZ averaged 12,600 kilometers between major failures versus Willys' 18,400 kilometers. The GAZ-67B was better than the GAZ-64 it replaced, but it remained decisively inferior to the vehicles Soviet engineers had dismissed 3 years earlier. Soviet forces continued requesting American Jeeps rather than domestically produced alternatives whenever both were available. The failure wasn't from lack of effort or engineering talent. Soviet engineers understood the theoretical principles, but American manufacturing capability, precision machining, quality control, metallurgy, electrical systems, was simply beyond Soviet industrial capacity during wartime. Soviet factories couldn't produce components to the tolerances American Jeeps required. Soviet quality control couldn't maintain consistency across thousands of vehicles. Soviet material science couldn't match American steel alloys and heat treatments. The GAZ-67B represented the best Soviet engineering could achieve with available resources and industrial capacity. It was respectable, but not competitive with American engineering backed by American industrial sophistication.
Statistics and technical assessments don't capture the emotional attachment Soviet soldiers developed toward American Jeeps. The relationship transcended mere utility. The Willys became a symbol of reliability in a war where everything else failed constantly. Soviet soldiers gave their Jeeps affectionate names. Willys itself became a Russian word, pronounced Willys, used as both a proper noun and a generic term for any small military vehicle. Soldiers would say, "I'm taking the Willys," even when referring to a Soviet GAZ vehicle. Common nicknames included Amerikanka, the American girl, Lastechka, little swallow, Truslivi Ivanovich, cowardly Ivan, an ironic name for a vehicle that went everywhere, and Blocha, the flea, referring to its ability to jump over obstacles. Lieutenant Alexander Bodnar, who drove a Willys Jeep from Stalingrad to Berlin, recorded his relationship with the vehicle in letters home. December 1943. My Willys has covered 23,000 kilometers since I received it. Every part of this vehicle is scarred with bullets, shrapnel, mud, and ice. The canvas top has been replaced 4 times. The tires are mismatched salvage from 3 different vehicles. The paint is gone, the seats are torn, the windshield is cracked. Yet, every morning it starts. Every day it carries me where I need to go. I trust this American machine more than I trust most men. This sentiment was nearly universal among Soviet soldiers who operated Jeeps regularly. The vehicle's reliability created profound psychological security in an environment where everything else, weapons, rations, communications,
Even human relationships could fail without warning. Senior Sergeant Yevgenia Zhigolenko, one of the famous Night Witches bomber pilots, used a captured Jeep for transportation between air bases. After flying missions in POG-2 biplanes held together with fabric and hope, the Willys Jeep felt like a tank. It never failed to start, never broke down, never required endless repairs like our Soviet vehicles. In a war where death comes from 1,000 technical failures, the Jeep represented the one machine that simply worked. This created immense emotional attachment. I wept when I had to turn in my Jeep at war's end. The attachment extended beyond operational reliability. Soviet soldiers appreciated design details that Soviet vehicles lacked. The Jeep's seats were more comfortable than Soviet equivalents. The steering was lighter and more responsive. The instrument panel was clearly labeled and logically organized. The windshield could fold down for better visibility. The hood could be opened quickly for field inspection. These seem like minor details, but to soldiers living in the machines for years, small ergonomic advantages accumulated into major quality-of-life differences.
In April 1945, Soviet forces prepared for the final assault on Berlin. Marshal Zhukov commanded 2.5 million soldiers, 6,250 tanks, and 41,600 artillery pieces in the largest battle in human history. The logistics challenge was unprecedented, supplying millions of soldiers across hundreds of kilometers while maintaining advanced speeds of 20 to 30 kilometers daily. American-supplied vehicles were crucial to Soviet success. Of the 142,000 vehicles supporting the Berlin operation, approximately 63,000 were American, 44% of total transportation capacity. But the Willys Jeeps performed a specific role that determined whether Soviet forces could maintain their assault pace: forward command and communication. Soviet command structure required constant communication between front headquarters, Army headquarters, Corps headquarters, division headquarters, and regimental headquarters. In the chaos of urban warfare across Berlin's ruins, radio communication was frequently disrupted. Physical courier transport became essential. Willys Jeeps became the primary courier vehicles because they were the only vehicles that could reliably traverse Berlin's bombed streets, navigate around rubble piles, ford flooded areas, and maintain speeds necessary for time-sensitive communications. The numbers tell the story. Soviet courier missions, Berlin operation, April 16th to May 2nd, 1945. Total missions, 47,293. Vehicle types used: Willys Jeeps, 28,847, or 61%, motorcycles, 12,103, or 26%, gas vehicles, 4,221, or 9%, and other vehicles, 2,122, or 4%. The Willys Jeep carried more critical communications during the Berlin operation than all other vehicle types combined. When Marshal Zhukov needed to coordinate tank armies converging on the Reichstag, the coordination orders traveled by Jeep. When Soviet artillery needed targeting updates, forward observers reported by Jeep-delivered message. The final message confirming German surrender, transmitted from the signing ceremony at Karlshorst to Moscow, was carried to the telegraph station by a Willys Jeep that had been in continuous operation since 1942 and had logged over 67,000 kilometers. That single vehicle's journey from Murmansk to Berlin symbolized the larger truth. The machine Soviet engineers had dismissed in 1941 had helped deliver victory in 1945.
When Soviet military historians compiled final statistics on Lend-Lease vehicle performance, the numbers told a story of decisive American superiority that Soviet propaganda would spend decades trying to obscure. Total vehicle kilometers logged by Soviet forces 1941 to 1945. Estimated 12.7 billion kilometers. American vehicles 7.8 billion kilometers, or 61%. Soviet vehicles, 4.9 billion kilometers, or 39%. Average vehicle lifespan. American vehicles, 87,400 kilometers before final mechanical failure. Soviet vehicles, 41,200 kilometers before final mechanical failure. Survival rate to war's end. American Jeeps, 34% still operational May 1945. Soviet GAZ vehicles, 8% still operational May 1945. The disparity is staggering. American vehicles, particularly Jeeps, proved more than twice as durable as Soviet equivalents. They traveled further, lasted longer, and required less maintenance throughout their operational lives. Soviet automotive engineers studying these numbers in 1946-1947 reached conclusions that would shape Soviet vehicle design for decades. American automotive engineering demonstrates superiority in all categories relevant to military operations: reliability, efficiency, durability, maintainability. This superiority stems from 1. Superior manufacturing precision, 2. Advanced metallurgy and material science, 3. Design philosophy prioritizing performance over simplicity, 4. Quality control standards exceeding Soviet capabilities, 5. Integration of electrical and mechanical systems to higher standards. Soviet automotive industry must implement comprehensive modernization to achieve parity with American engineering standards. This modernization never fully occurred. The Soviet automotive industry made improvements, but the gap established during World War II persisted throughout the Cold War. Soviet military vehicles remained inferior to American equivalents for generations.
In 1985, 40 years after war's end, Soviet military journal Vojenno-Historicheski Journal published interviews with Eastern Front veterans reflecting on the war's equipment and technology. The section on vehicles produced responses that would have been impossible during Stalin's era. Marshal Ivan Konev, who commanded multiple front operations. Without American trucks and Jeeps, we would have lost the war. The Willys Jeep in particular provided capabilities Soviet industry could not deliver. This is not criticism of Soviet workers or engineers. It is recognition of industrial and technological realities. The Jeep was simply a superior machine. General Vasily Chuikov, defender of Stalingrad. I have read Soviet accounts minimizing Lend-Lease importance. These accounts are false. The Red Army advanced to Berlin on American trucks and Jeeps. The Willys vehicle proved itself the most reliable machine on the Eastern Front. We should honor American engineering that contributed to our victory, rather than pretending we achieved victory solely through our own resources. These admissions, published during Gorbachev's Glasnost period, revealed what Soviet veterans had known for decades, but couldn't publicly acknowledge. The Jeep Soviet engineers mocked in 1941 had been essential to Soviet victory. By 1985, few of these Jeeps survived. Most had been worked to death during the war or scrapped in the immediate post-war period when Soviet industry resumed vehicle production. But veterans who had driven them remembered them with reverence reserved for weapons that had saved their lives repeatedly. Anatoly Mereshko, who served as a junior officer throughout the war and drove a Willys Jeep from Moscow to Prague. I have owned 7 vehicles in my life since the war. None matched my wartime Willys for reliability, performance, or simple pleasure to operate. That machine taught me what engineering excellence means. It was American. It was capitalist. It represented everything Soviet ideology told us to reject. But it was also the best vehicle I ever drove. Truth doesn't care about ideology.
The Willys Jeep's superiority forced Soviet automotive engineers to fundamentally reconsider their design philosophy. The lessons learned influenced Soviet vehicle development for decades, though Soviet industry lacked the capacity to fully implement American standard manufacturing.
Key lessons absorbed into Soviet design. Power-to-weight ratio matters more than absolute power. Post-war Soviet vehicles emphasized efficiency rather than brute force. The GAZ-69, introduced in 1953 as the Soviet Jeep successor, weighed 1,525 kilograms, but featured a 55-horsepower engine, significantly better power to weight than wartime Soviet vehicles. Manufacturing precision enables reliability. Soviet factories invested heavily in precision machining equipment in the 1950s, attempting to match American manufacturing tolerances. They never fully succeeded, but improvements were substantial. Sophisticated simplicity beats crude simplicity. Soviet designers recognized that well-engineered complexity could be more reliable than poorly engineered simplicity. Post-war vehicles featured more sophisticated transmissions, electrical systems, and suspension designs. Ergonomics affect operational effectiveness. Soviet vehicles began incorporating features like adjustable seats, better instrument visibility, and improved driver positioning. Details considered bourgeois frivolity before the war, but recognized as operationally relevant after experiencing American design. This influence extended beyond military vehicles. Soviet civilian automobiles produced after 1955 showed clear American influence in design philosophy, though not in execution quality. The idea that vehicles should be comfortable, efficient, and pleasant to operate rather than merely functional represented a fundamental shift in Soviet automotive thinking. This shift traced directly to the wartime experience with American vehicles, particularly the Willys Jeep that had outperformed every Soviet design.
The Willys Jeep's influence extended beyond engineering into Soviet culture itself. The word Willys became permanently embedded in Russian language, surviving long after the vehicles themselves had disappeared. In post-war Soviet Union, Willys became generic slang for any small, rugged vehicle, regardless of origin. A Soviet GAZ-69 was often called Nash Willys, our Willys. The word carried connotations of
The Willys Jeep's influence extended beyond engineering into Soviet culture itself. The word Willys became permanently embedded in Russian language, surviving long after the vehicles themselves had disappeared. In post-war Soviet Union, Willys became generic slang for any small, rugged vehicle, regardless of origin. A Soviet GAZ-69 was often called Nash Willys, our Willys. The word carried connotations of reliability, adventure, and capability that no Soviet vehicle name could match. Soviet cinema of the 1950s-1970s frequently featured Willys Jeeps in war films, even when portraying events where Soviet vehicles should have been shown. Directors recognized audiences associated the Jeep with authenticity and military professionalism. The distinctive silhouette became visual shorthand for serious military operations. Soviet children's toys included die-cast Willys models long after the actual vehicles had vanished from Soviet roads. The Jeep represented adventure and heroism in ways Soviet-designed vehicles never achieved in popular imagination. Even Soviet military slang incorporated Jeep terminology. Riding Willys style meant pushing forward aggressively despite obstacles. Tough as a Willys described soldiers who continued functioning despite exhaustion or injury. The vehicle's reputation for reliability became a metaphor for human endurance. This cultural penetration annoyed Soviet ideologists who wanted to emphasize Soviet industrial achievement and minimize American contributions to victory. But the popular affection for the Jeep proved impossible to suppress. Veterans knew what had actually won the war, and they taught their children and grandchildren the truth. By the 1980s, surviving Willys Jeeps had become collector's items in the Soviet Union. valued far beyond their practical utility. A restored wartime Jeep could command prices equivalent to 3 years' average Soviet salary. The vehicles represented not just historical artifacts, but symbols of a time when American and Soviet forces had fought together against fascism. German forces fighting on the Eastern Front quickly learned to recognize and respect the Willys Jeep's capabilities. Wehrmacht after-action reports and veteran accounts reveal that German soldiers considered the American Jeep a more formidable opponent than Soviet vehicles. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding reconnaissance units on the Eastern Front, wrote in his memoirs, "The appearance of American Jeeps in Soviet reconnaissance units beginning in 1942 marked a significant escalation in Soviet capability. These vehicles operated at speeds and across terrain that Soviet reconnaissance vehicles could not match. We learned to treat the sound of approaching Jeep engines as a serious threat indicator rather than merely advanced scouts." German intelligence bulletins from 1943 specifically warned troops about Soviet units equipped with American vehicles. Quote, "Enemy reconnaissance formations equipped with American Willys Jeeps demonstrate significantly enhanced operational capability. These vehicles exhibit A. Superior speed, enabling rapid approach and withdrawal. B. Excellent cross-country mobility, allowing infiltration through previously secure flanks. C. Reliability, permitting deep penetration operations. D. Quiet operation at low speeds, complicating acoustic detection." Unquote. The tactical implications were significant. German defensive planning had been based on assumptions about Soviet vehicle capabilities. The introduction of superior American vehicles disrupted these assumptions, forcing German forces to maintain wider security perimeters and allocate more resources to flank protectors. German soldiers who captured intact Willys Jeeps frequently pressed them into Wehrmacht service rather than destroying them. This was unusual. German doctrine typically required destruction of captured vehicles to prevent their return to enemy use. But the Jeep's superiority over German equivalents was so pronounced that Wehrmacht units made exceptions. Photographs from the Eastern Front show Willys Jeeps with German markings operating in Wehrmacht reconnaissance units, often alongside Kübelwagens, the German equivalent. German mechanics who maintained these captured vehicles reported they were easier to service and more reliable than German-manufactured reconnaissance vehicles. One German mechanic's diary entry from 1944 captures the professional respect German engineers developed for American design. Quote, "February 17, 1944. Completed maintenance on captured American Willys. The engineering quality exceeds our own reconnaissance vehicles. Every component is manufactured to higher precision than equivalent German parts. The engine runs smoother, transmission shifts more cleanly, suspension absorbs impacts our vehicles cannot handle. I am a loyal German and believe in German engineering superiority, but this American machine challenges that belief. They have built a reconnaissance vehicle superior to ours in every measurable category. This is uncomfortable truth, but truth nonetheless." Unquote.
To understand the Willys Jeep's true impact on the Eastern Front, we must examine its contribution in context of the overall Soviet war effort. Total Lend-Lease aid to Soviet Union, 1941-1945, $11.3 billion, 1945 dollars, equivalent to approximately $180 billion in 2025. Vehicles as percentage of Lend-Lease aid. By value, 18%, $2.03 billion. By significance, assessed by Soviet commanders as among top 3 most crucial categories, alongside aircraft and food. Willys Jeep specific impact. Total delivered 51,503 vehicles. Average service life, 87,400 kilometers. Total distance traveled by all Jeeps, estimated 4.5 billion kilometers, equivalent to 112,000 trips around Earth's equator. Comparative Soviet production. Soviet reconnaissance vehicles produced 1941-1945, 92,843 all types. Soviet reconnaissance vehicles operational, May 1945, 7,428. American Jeeps operational, May 1945, 24,673. The American Jeeps outnumbered operational Soviet reconnaissance vehicles by more than 3-to-1 at war's end, despite Soviet Union producing nearly twice as many domestic vehicles during the war. This disparity reveals the brutal reality. Soviet vehicles wore out or broke down at rates that left the Red Army increasingly dependent on American equipment. Impact on Soviet operational capability. Military historians estimate that, without American vehicles, Soviet forces would have required 40 to 60% more time to complete major offensive operations. 25 to 40% larger logistics forces to achieve equivalent supply delivery. Reduced reconnaissance capability, limiting tactical intelligence. Reduced artillery effectiveness due to slower ammunition delivery. Marshal Zhukov estimated in private correspondence that the absence of Lend-Lease vehicles would have extended the war by 12 to 18 months and cost an additional 2 to 3 million Soviet casualties. These numbers contextualize the Jeep's importance. It wasn't merely a good vehicle, it was a war-winning asset that enabled Soviet forces to maintain operational tempo that German forces couldn't match.
After World War II, as the Cold War intensified, Soviet propaganda systematically minimized American contributions to Soviet victory. Lend-Lease aid was described as minimal and largely irrelevant to the outcome of the Eastern Front. This required creative rewriting of history, particularly regarding vehicles. Soviet historical accounts from the 1950s to 1970s portrayed Soviet victory as achieved primarily with Soviet-manufactured equipment, with Lend-Lease vehicles mentioned only briefly as supplementary assistance. The statistical manipulation was blatant. Soviet Official History, 1970s version. The Soviet Union produced 265,600 vehicles during the Great Patriotic War, supplemented by Allied deliveries of approximately 400,000 vehicles, primarily utilized in rear areas and secondary fronts. Actual reality: Soviet forces operated 427,284 Lend-Lease vehicles, representing 61% of total vehicle kilometers traveled, with American vehicles disproportionately deployed to critical frontline operations where reliability was essential. Photographs in Soviet military museums were selectively chosen to show Soviet-manufactured vehicles. When photographs inevitably showed American Jeeps, because they were ubiquitous, captions would identify them generically as reconnaissance vehicles, without mentioning American origin. Soviet veterans who attempted to publicly acknowledge American contributions faced official disapproval. Memoirs submitted for publication had references to Lend-Lease vehicles edited or removed. The message was clear. Soviet victory was Soviet achievement, American contributions were marginal. This historical revisionism persisted until the 1980s, when glasnost permitted more honest historical assessment. The publication of Zhukov's full memoirs in 1969, he died in 1974, included passages acknowledging Lend-Lease importance, but even these were carefully limited. The full truth emerged only after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, when previously restricted archives became accessible to researchers.
The documents revealed what Soviet veterans had always known. American vehicles, particularly the Willys Jeep, had been absolutely crucial to Soviet victory.
With the perspective of decades and access to complete records, automotive historians can now definitively analyze why Soviet vehicles proved so inferior to American equivalents during World War II. Manufacturing quality control. American factories operated with statistical quality control methodologies developed in the 1930s. Every component was measured against specifications, with rejection of parts outside tolerance bands. Soviet factories used visual inspection and rough gauging, allowing significant variation in component specifications. Result: American vehicles assembled from consistently manufactured components operated reliably. Soviet vehicles assembled from variable quality components experienced premature failures from parts that barely met specifications. Metallurgy. American steel mills produced alloys to precise specifications with controlled heat treatment. Soviet wartime steel production, operating under extreme pressure, produced more variable metallurgy with less consistent properties. Result: American vehicle components, gears, axles, frames, maintained strength throughout service life. Soviet components experienced premature wear and failure from metallurgical inconsistencies. Design philosophy. American engineers designed for 50,000-plus kilometer service life with minimal maintenance. Soviet engineers designed for 20,000-kilometer service life, assuming frequent field maintenance and component replacement. Result: American vehicles exceeded design life with minimal intervention. Soviet vehicles barely achieved design life despite constant maintenance. Supply chain integration. American vehicles were designed with spare parts logistics in mind: modular components, standardized fasteners, interchangeable assemblies. Soviet vehicles featured more custom components requiring specialized parts. Result: American vehicles could be repaired with parts from supply chain or even cannibalized from other vehicles. Soviet vehicles often required specific factory-produced components unavailable at the front. The cumulative effect of these differences was devastating. Soviet vehicles weren't poorly designed by incompetent engineers. They were designed by capable engineers working under constraints Americans never faced. But the result was vehicles that couldn't compete with American equivalents in the brutal testing ground of the Eastern Front.
In the Central Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow, one Willys Jeep sits on permanent display. Its placard reads, "American Willys MB Reconnaissance Vehicle, serial number 158342, delivered through Lend-Lease program, November 1941. Operational service, Moscow Front, Stalingrad Front, 1st Ukrainian Front. Total distance traveled, 73,420 kilometers. Participated in liberation of Moscow region, Stalingrad, Ukraine, Poland, and final assault on Berlin." This single vehicle's documented history illuminates the larger story of how American Jeeps won the Eastern Front. November 1941. Delivered to Murmansk, driven 2,100 kilometers to Moscow Front. December 1941. Assigned to 32nd Rifle Division Reconnaissance Company. January to March 1942. Daily reconnaissance patrols. Average 80 kilometers per day. April to June 1942. Rasputitsa operations. Only reconnaissance vehicle in company maintaining operations. July 1942. Transferred to Stalingrad Front as division relocated. August to November 1942. Stalingrad urban operations. 127 documented combat missions. December 1942. Engine replacement, only major mechanical intervention. January to December 1943. Continuous operations across southern Russia. January to December 1944. Advanced through Ukraine and into Poland. January to May 1945. Berlin operation. Carried orders for final assault on Reichstag. May 8, 1945, present at German surrender ceremony, Karlshorst. This single vehicle's documented history illuminates the larger story of how American Jeeps won the Eastern Front. November 1941, delivered to Murmansk, driven 2,100 kilometers to Moscow front. December 1941, assigned to 32nd Rifle Division Reconnaissance Company. January to March 1942, daily reconnaissance patrols, average 80 kilometers per day. April to June 1942, Rasputitsa operations, only reconnaissance vehicle in company maintaining operations. July 1942, transferred to Stalingrad front as division relocated. August to November 1942, Stalingrad urban operations, 127 documented combat missions. December 1942, engine replacement, only major mechanical intervention. January to December 1943, continuous operations across southern Russia. January to December 1944, advanced through Ukraine and into Poland. January to May 1945, Berlin operation, carried orders for final assault on Reichstag. May 8, 1945, present at German surrender ceremony, Karlshorst. This single vehicle's documented history illuminates the larger story of how American Jeeps won the Eastern Front. When Soviet forces withdrew this Jeep from service in June 1945, military historians recognized its documentary value. Rather than scrapping it with thousands of other worn-out vehicles, they preserved it as a testament to Lend-Lease cooperation. The Jeep's maintenance log, preserved with the vehicle, shows total maintenance interventions, 47, major component replacements, 2, engine and transmission. Average interval between maintenance, 1,562 kilometers. Operational availability, 94%. Percentage of days vehicle was mission capable. For comparison, a typical GAZ-64 serving in similar roles averaged total maintenance interventions, 112. Major component replacements, 7. Average interval between maintenance, 687 kilometers. Operational availability, 71%. One Jeep's story, but multiplied across 51,503 vehicles, tells the larger truth that American engineering delivered reliability that Soviet engineering couldn't match. The numbers don't lie, the distances don't lie, and the vehicle sitting in the Moscow Museum doesn't lie. It simply proved through 73,420 kilometers of the world's most brutal warfare that Soviet engineers had been wrong to mock what they didn't understand.
The story of the Willys Jeep on the Eastern Front is ultimately a story about the collision between ideology and reality. Soviet engineering philosophy, rooted in materialist dialectics and belief in Soviet industrial superiority, declared that American consumer-oriented capitalism couldn't produce military equipment matching Soviet purpose-built socialism. The Eastern Front proved this ideology completely wrong. The Jeep Soviet engineers mocked in June 1941 as too light, too weak, too complex, and too fragile for Soviet conditions proved tougher, more reliable, and more capable than any Soviet-manufactured vehicle. It operated in conditions that destroyed Soviet trucks, traversed terrain where Soviet reconnaissance vehicles became stuck, and continued functioning long after Soviet equivalents had worn out. By May 1945, the Red Army had traveled further in American Jeeps than in all Soviet-manufactured reconnaissance vehicles combined. Soviet commanders personally chose American Jeeps over Soviet alternatives when both were available. Soviet soldiers developed emotional attachments to American vehicles that they never developed towards Soviet machinery. The numbers tell the story that ideology tried to suppress. 51,503 Willys Jeeps delivered, 4.5 billion kilometers traveled, 87,400 kilometers average service life, 0.3% mechanical failure rate,
and 34% still operational at war's end. These statistics represent more than mechanical achievement. They represent the vindication of American engineering philosophy over Soviet assumptions. They prove that sophisticated precision manufacturing beats crude, simplistic design. They demonstrate that industrial capitalism could outproduce and outperform industrial socialism on socialism's own chosen battlefield. Soviet engineers eventually absorbed these lessons. Post-war Soviet vehicle design showed clear American influence, even as Soviet propaganda minimized American contributions to victory. The Gaz-69, UAA's 469, and subsequent Soviet military vehicles incorporated design principles learned from studying American Jeeps, even when Soviet manufacturing capacity couldn't fully implement American standard quality. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. An entire generation of Soviet soldiers, engineers, and commanders learned through direct experience that American engineering excellence was real, not propaganda. They had driven American vehicles across continents, maintained them in impossible conditions, and depended on them for their lives. No amount of post-war propaganda could erase that knowledge. The Willys Jeep broke more mechanical records on the Eastern Front. It broke the myth of inevitable Soviet technological superiority. It demonstrated that free market capitalism could produce better military equipment than command economy socialism. It proved that American workers and engineers could outperform Soviet equivalents even in conditions specifically designed to favor Soviet approaches.
Marshal Zhukov, the man who commanded Soviet forces from Moscow to Berlin, stated the truth plainly in his memoirs, published after his death when he could no longer face political consequences. The most underappreciated factor in Soviet victory was American industrial production delivered through Lend-Lease. The Willys Jeep in particular proved itself superior to any vehicle Soviet industry produced during the war. This is not an admission of Soviet weakness, but recognition of American strength. We should honor those who helped us achieve victory, rather than pretending we achieved victory alone. That honest assessment from the Soviet Union's greatest military commander serves as the final verdict on the vehicle Soviet engineers had mocked in 1941. The Willys Jeep didn't just outlast every tank on the Eastern Front, it outlasted Soviet ideology itself, serving as a mobile testament to the superiority of engineering excellence over political dogma, precision manufacturing over crude simplicity, and capitalist innovation over socialist central planning. The small machine with the canvas top rolled across the largest battlefield in human history for 1,418 days, covering billions of kilometers, surviving conditions that destroyed purpose-built Soviet military vehicles, and proving every single day that Soviet engineers had been catastrophically wrong about what makes a vehicle great. It started every morning, it ran all day, it survived everything the Eastern Front could throw at it. And in the end, it helped deliver Soviet victory despite Soviet engineers' initial conviction that it was inadequate for the task. The German generals who invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941 were defeated by many factors: Soviet resistance, brutal winter, overstretched supply lines, strategic miscalculations. But they were also defeated by American industrial might, delivered in the form of 427,284 vehicles that Soviet forces couldn't have produced domestically. Among those vehicles, the Willys Jeep stood supreme, not the most numerous, not the most powerful, not the most dramatic, but the most reliable, most trusted, most loved by the soldiers who operated it.
Soviet engineers had mocked the American Jeep. Soviet soldiers revered it. History vindicated the soldiers' judgment. The machine they called Willys earned its place in their hearts and in history through the simplest possible means. It worked when nothing else did. And that, in the end, was enough to help change the world.